What started as a colonial dispute quickly became a fight for world dominance. Vietnam's struggle for independence became a battle of competing ideologies. Would capitalism prevail, or would communism sweep through Asia, giving more power to the Soviets? Hi, I'm Trudy Winkelspecht, and today on the show we will revisit the war in Vietnam to see how the war went from a small movement of independence between the Vietnamese and the French to a war for world dominance. Here with me I have Dr. Giorgio, Professor of Communism and Vietnamese History at Vanderwoodson University. Dr. Giorgio, welcome.
Thank you, Trudy. I'm happy to be on the show.
Dr. Giorgio, what governments were influential in supporting the Vietnamese nationalist movement, and how did their role bring the United States into the conflict?
Well, as you said in your introduction, Trudy, the key factor in why so many countries took an interest in what had previously been a colonial war between the French and the Vietnamese was communism. I mean, in terms of world politics at the time, this being the post-World War II world, the United States was the sole Western power that had not been decimated by the Nazi regime, and the Soviet Union also being one of the powers that had been left nearly unscathed. So these two became at odds with each other due to their differing ideologies, starting obviously what we know to be the Cold War. And the United States felt it was their duty to prevent the ideology of communism from spreading outside of the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, though, the U.S. actually didn't get involved in the conflict in Vietnam until, obviously, these communist powers started getting involved. And in 1949, Mao Zedong took control of China and established the Communist People's Republic there. And in its new government, he started offering military assistance, sanctuary, all sorts of assistance to the Vietnamese rebels, the Viet Minh. And the United States, led at the time by Harry Truman, was, already concerned about the spread of communism throughout East Asia. If you look at 1950, with communist North Korea attacking pro-Western South Korea, at this point, the U.S. felt that they could no longer remain uninvolved in East Asia. And they saw the war in Vietnam, along with the conflict in Korea, as a zero-sum game. Any win for communism, they felt, was a loss for the free world.
Thank you, Dr. Giorgio. And here from our studios in Stars Hollow, Connecticut, I have Dr. Belinda, Cold War historian at Humphrey College, to add to our discussion of the U.S.'s involvement in the war in Vietnam. Dr. Belinda, can you speak to the role that the U.S. played once it had inserted itself in the war?
Thank you for having me, Trudy. The influence of the United States was quite significant at the time, since policymakers like Harry S. Truman and Lyndon B. Johnson involved themselves in Vietnam and created the U.S. involvement into a full-scale war. After absorbing much of the cost of the war by aligning with France in 1950, the United States created an anti-communist government in South Vietnam in 1954 in order to stop the spread of communism in South Vietnam and throughout Southeast Asia. Elections were called for at the Geneva Convention in order to unify the country, but when they weren't held, former Viet Minh attacked the U.S.-backed government of Ngo Dinh Diem. The U.S. responded by significantly expanding their involvement in Diem's government until it fell in 1963 due to an insurgency of the National Liberation Front, which later became known as the Viet Cong to its enemies. To be completely transparent, Trudy, the truth behind why the U.S. remained in the war was due to LBJ's fear of being responsible for World War III. The U.S. felt responsible for not intervening sooner in the spread of fascism in Europe and Japan, and they did not want to risk making that mistake again. The U.S. fighting techniques, however, varied from the traditional senses of fighting. The Johnson administration was adamant to fight the war in cold blood, which meant a lack of direct fighting and a focus on a systematic and moderate approach. LBJ feared that outright attack would create alliances between the communist groups and therefore increase the chances of the war escalating. Despite the difficulties in gaining public support when fighting this type of war, Johnson went to great lengths to maintain it, such as his refusal to allow pursuit of the Northern Vietnamese and the NLF units. Such a determination to gradual development, however, allowed Hanoi to adapt to the bombings, protect its most valuable resources, and increase its capability of protecting itself against the United States government and army.
So you're saying then, Dr. Belinda, that the U.S.'s involvement in the war actually prolonged it? And I believe that the issue of whether they should have been in the war at all is still a controversial one.
You are absolutely right, Trudy.
All right, well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you both so much for being with us.
You know, Trudy, it's my pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Trudy. Thanks again for having us on the show.
and thank you all for tuning in tonight. Join us next week for our discussion of the social and political impacts of industrialization in Japan. Alright, done.